This is Chapter 2, Introduction to Physical Education, Fitness, and Sport, the Evolution of Physical Activity, Philosophies, and Programs. When we look at the beginning of physical education in the U.S., we first have to look at gymnastics. Yes, gymnastics was the beginning of what we know as physical education. Major European influences on the U.S. came from Germany and Sweden. The Swedish style of gymnastics was also known as medical gymnastics. The American system of gymnastics, we have some key figures. One, Neeson, and the other, Beecher. Beecher developed a system appropriate for female activities. Some other key figures in America included Hitchcock and Sargent. In 1885, William Anderson created the Association of the Advancement of Physical Education, and Hanna, who developed the first physical education teacher preparation program. Other individuals, Thomas Wood created the International Congress on Education and presented what we know as the New Physical Education. He had a couple of students, Clark and Luther, and these are important names to remember. And Cassidy published the New Physical Education. When we look at the role of physical activity from a historical perspective, we go back 10,000 BC, really didn't have to worry about physical activity. We were hunters and gatherers. And then between 2500 to 200 BC, Eastern cultures recognized the connection of health problems and lack of exercise and eating and all of that. The Greek and Romans, mainly men, really worked hard at their bodies to be ready for military and the worshiping of gods. The Dark Ages, we return back to kind of the survival of it. The Renaissance, physical activity viewed as central to intellectual learning. The national period of Europe, emergence of the Swedish and the German gymnastic systems. In the 20th century, Roosevelt was a proponent of physical activity. The Great Depression slowed the physical education. Recreation was dramatically increased during the Great Depression, and poor fitness in the military in both world wars. The development of physical fitness was emphasized heavily in World War I. And the Weber test showed fitness differences between the European and American children. The European children were more fit than America. I wonder if we were to retest and compare American children to European children, what we would find. In the 20th century, following the World War II, lifetime activities were heavily emphasized within the physical education curriculum because we knew in World War I the soldiers coming in were less fit, so we needed to do something, and so we emphasized physical education in the curriculum. In the 50s, minimal muscular fitness test in children, and JFK considered the Americans as the soft Americans and developed national effort to develop youth fitness programs. I wonder how American children compares to the rest of the world today. Between the 50s and 60s, the emergence of kinesiology and exercise physiology as a scientific field. Sports psychology, motor learning, biomechanics are also considered as exercise science subdisciplines. And in 1968, Kenneth Cooper, aerobics, was a key figure of Madison viewing aerobic exercise from a preventive perspective. So how did sport emerge in America? We first increasingly industrialized, urbanized culture along with emerging middle class helped sports become more institutionalized. and immigration, transportation, urbanization is considered an important cultural influence on the profession of sports and physical education. People started moving and living closer together, so there was more people around, more time, and so it just became from those influences. When we look at how did it become institutionalized, and we're talking about sports in America, first of all, we had to have some type of rules. It was very difficult to play a game when you did not have rules. So standardizing of rules, oversight by some type of governmental organization. Standards for competition. So what were the standards, what were the levels, all of that of competitions. Championships were formed, records were kept, and traditions and rituals were developed. So what about the roots of various sports? Nearly all early programs of physical education were of team sports. For example, in Europe, you had golf and tennis, baseball and football. And football was not in America considered a very popular spectator sport pre the 1800s period. And in the U.S., our sports were basketball and volleyball. A lot has changed since then. So what about college sports? In the 50s, little to no sport on campuses. Students really drove the explosion of sports. University administration stepped in to have an oversight. All of these students were doing these sports, and so the university's administrators said, okay, we've got to do something. We need to make rules, and we need to watch out for this. There were a lot of abuses. A lot of people got hurt, especially in football. If you look at the history of football, a lot of kids were getting brain injuries, broken necks, and even died on the football field. Eligibility and athletic treatment. In 1882, Harvard was the first ever faculty athletic committee was formed. So in 82, Harvard formed the committee. 95, the Conference of Faculty Representatives, which would eventually become what we know now is the Big Ten Conference, even though we know there's more than 10. Trilling organizes the Athletic Conference of American College for Women. So women in sports kind of lag behind, of course. Okay, so sports during the Depression and World War II. So during the Depression, spectator sports suffered for many reasons. Young men were called to war and there were less free time. The shift toward participating in youth, family sport, and informal kinds of participation. Sports in high school, colleges, and universities continue to at a reduced level. And professional sport also suffered. A guy by the name of Philip K. Wrigley of Wrigley Gum really worried about baseball. He was the owner of the Chicago Cubs. Wrigley believed that women could help by playing baseball. He believed that baseball's survival depended on women during the war. By 1942, Wrigley was forming his professional women's league. You may have watched the movie, the 1992 film of A League of Their Own, starring Tom Hanks and Madonna. So what about after World War II? Explosive growth of sports at all levels. We also had Brown versus Board of Education, where we saw that you had separate is not equal, where we had African American schools and white schools, and we realized that they were not equal, that the white schools were better. We had Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring, where she wrote regarding the environmental dangers of pesticides. Also, Title IX, 1972, was a piece of legislation that greatly increased sport opportunities for women. And then the Public Law 94-142 is the rights of individuals with disabilities. What about some philosophical influences? The Europe, there was about patriot. being patriotic and playing sports and being physically fit. The Puritans, strict forms of religion, they felt that if you did anything to the body, it was not holy. We came across the muscular Christianity, which kind of changed that Puritan thought. It was a philosophy that views physical fitness and sporting really as avenues for mental, moral, and religious purposes. And Ralph Waldo Emerson published The Conduct of Life, which the first wealth is health. So what about the 19th century views of women? Females should be raised to occupy narrow roles. Mild forms of proper exercise are useful. Women need to be very feminine, pure, submissive, and there should be acceptable activities, but they should be less strenuous. That certainly is not like it today. Also, females should not be raised. Since the 1950s, how did the following movement events influence our fields? The environmental movement. We now have bike trails. We now have greenways. So we're building the environment for moving. Also, the civil rights movement. The most well-developed scientific area of the beginning of the academic discipline movement was exercise physiology. So those were famous movements. In the fitness wellness movement, a better understanding of the relationship of fitness and healthy lifestyles. Then the emergence of kinesiology. We have exercise physiology, biomechanics, sport learning, sport and exercise, sport sociology, history, sport pedagogy. This is the end of chapter 2.